Okay, so I'm just going to go over some of the arguments for why natural law is an unhelpful way of deciding whether something is right or wrong, because it focuses too much on, are we meeting our purpose, our telos? Number one, well, maybe we've all got a unique purpose. Maybe all human beings don't have the same purpose, the same goal that they're striving towards. Maybe we are all little snowflakes with our own telos. If that's the case, then it wouldn't make sense for you to say that something was right or wrong based on whether it was meeting the telos of human beings, because there wouldn't be a universal telos. There is no universal rule of how we should and shouldn't behave, because there isn't a universal purpose for all of us. So that would be an ineffective thing to do. And Aquinas kind of makes an allowance himself and sort of suggests that actually, yeah, as much as I've put forward these primary precepts, I'm going to accept that there are some people who have a different purpose in their lives than to fulfill them. So he talks about priests, and how they're kind of called by God to be a member of the priesthood, and so they don't, therefore, because they take a vow of celibacy, which means they're never going to have sex, and they therefore don't have children and don't fulfill the primary precept of recreation, or procreation rather. So priests don't have children, they don't fulfill that primary precept, and Aquinas accepts that. He accepts that they have a unique telos, a unique purpose. So what's to say then that there aren't more unique purposes and unique teloses for more people and not just priests? And what's to say that there is one telos and purpose for all of us? Perhaps we all have our own individual one. The second kind of objection relates to the philosopher that you looked at a couple of videos ago, and kind of Sartre, amongst others, as an existentialist, was all about kind of human freedom, human autonomy, and sort of said that there isn't any universal purpose for all human life. He was very much opposed to that, as all existentialist philosophers are. The idea of existentialism is that you have to decide your own purpose, your own kind of place within the world, and you are entirely free to do that. And that's why people kind of talk about, like, oh, having an existential crisis. It's when you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself. It's normally something that people talk about, when you get to your mid-20s and you're kind of like, oh, I've done with education, I've done what I think I'm supposed to do, but now what do I do? I've followed the kind of the path of tradition, the path of, go to school, get your A-levels, go to uni, get your degree, go meet your partner, have children, blah, 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 but what do I do now? So the reason that they're kind of in those kind of crisis points is because they've sort of followed the path set out for them and then realised that actually they've got to a point where they're free to make choices for themselves and they don't have to continue on that path if they don't want to. They can choose a different life for themselves. And that's kind of, as I say, like an existential crisis that some people go through. So for an existentialist, the person who's done that, who's followed the traditional route of, going to uni, they've done so in bad faith. They've done so kind of assuming that that's what they have to do with their life because, that's the purpose, that's the telos of being a human being. And they're having this point of crisis because they're realizing that actually, no, you as an individual decide what your place in the world is and what you should and shouldn't be doing within the world. You're completely free to choose those things. So for an existentialist, kind of telling someone that they're doing the right thing because they go to university at a certain age, or the wrong thing because they are choosing not to have children and procreate, that would be completely, it's just wrong. They would completely disagree with that. Okay. We don't all have the same purpose to educate and to procreate, and therefore we're free to make choices about what we do and don't want to do with our lives, whether we want to procreate, be educated, or not. Right, the third issue with natural law is, Aquinas' version anyway, is entirely based on the kind of the assumption that God exists and God has some divine plan and purpose for humanity, and that our lives should be entirely based on trying to achieve that purpose. But if you turn around and say, well, God doesn't exist, I'm an atheist or a humanist, I don't necessarily believe that God exists or feel the need to define myself in terms of my relation to a God that may or may not exist. And so, if that's the case, if God's plan is in the bin, then there's no kind of universal purpose for humans, according to what kind of Aquinas would put forward. There is no universal plan because the plan is entirely based on trying to get close to God and trying to ultimately achieve that great purpose or great telos, ultimate telos. So, objection number 4, kind of going down a sciencey route now. So, yeah, the theory of evolution is kind of an obvious criticism for this. It's the same kind of criticism that's put forward when we looked at the teleological arguments for God. And again, you can use many of the criticisms from that for this. Essentially, if the world had a purpose, we look at the world as human beings and we go, wow, well, that's clearly got a purpose to it. And that's, the way that trees breathe out oxygen and take in carbon dioxide, whilst humans need other way around. The way that trees take in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, whilst humans need and breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. That cycle of us giving to each other exactly what we need, humans and plants, back and forth to help each other, like the kind of the intricacies of ways that different biomes and things fit together, and all the smallest creatures are essential to helping the larger animals to exist, and sunlight needs to be just the right amount for that area. All that intricacy and that detail would suggest to us as human beings that there's some sort of design there, that it's been made that way for a purpose. But then Darwin comes along and goes, sorry, my friend, I think you're mistaken. It's just coincidence. The fact is, it's kind of slowly evolved. I say the fact, the theory is that it's slowly evolved over millennia, and so it fits to the environment so well because it has adapted in the same way that Darwin observed different finches in the Galapagos Islands, so different birds, if you can't tell what those pictures are, with different types of beaks. So the same bird, a finch, had kind of like adapted and developed different types of beaks for different parts of the islands. So some had really pointy, thin beaks where they wanted to be able to get into small crevices and kind of like holes in trees to get insects. Some had kind of bigger, firmer beaks where they wanted to be able to smash things and get access to insects and things that way. So they've all adapted their beaks and evolved their beaks to suit their environment. It's not the case that kind of they were designed that way. They've just adapted and changed over time. And if they hadn't done that, they would have died out anyway, and we wouldn't have known about them. Okay, so yeah, the issue with saying that something is good or bad depending on whether it meets its purpose, according to the theory of evolution, is that there is no purpose. We're seeing purpose where there isn't any. We're inferring purpose, and we're feeling like, oh, that's clearly been created for a reason and designed that way for a reason. It hasn't. It's just slowly changed over a long period of time to meet its needs. So if there is no purpose and telos to the world, we've just evolved that way. We shouldn't make judgments about whether something is good or bad based on whether it meets its purpose. We shouldn't say, you are doing what is right for a human being because you're procreating and meeting your purpose, when there is no purpose. The next issue with defining right and wrong based on whether it adheres to or follows the purpose is that essentially, the idea of having a telos, having a purpose itself, it's not really been proven. There is some kind of evidence to support it, anecdotal evidence. So kind of like after the fact, we can observe things, but even so, when we look at things like, the theory of evolution, we have alternative explanations for why things might look purposeful, and give the appearance of purpose when actually they're not. So the fact is, it isn't proven that there is a purpose for everything within the universe, let alone the universe itself, let alone a divine creator which gives everything its purpose. So if we're going to kind of judge whether someone's acting in the right or wrong way, we shouldn't really be using the idea of have they met their purpose? Are they meeting their purpose as a human being? Because, well, we don't know that there is a purpose. We haven't proven that there's one to judge the person on anyway. And then the next criticism. Well, essentially, as I said before, any of the criticisms that you would apply to the teleological arguments would also be applicable here. So there's a couple that I'm just going to reference quickly by Hume. So the ideas of natural law can be seen to be committing the naturalistic fallacy. So that's when you make an observation of the way that something is in the world and therefore jump to the conclusion that that is how things ought to be in the world. So if we observe, look at the primary precepts. So we're going to observe the world and we're going to see that it is the case that most people procreate, most people look after innocent people, most people want to be educated, etc. Okay, that is the way that things are in the world at the moment. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way things ought to be. So we can look at things and observe the way that things are, but that doesn't mean it's how that they should be. That doesn't mean we can make a moral judgment just by observing what something does and say, well, that's what it should be doing. So, for example, like if you consider the way that we treated people of different races historically, we saw that, we used to believe that certain people were superior to others because of their race. Well, if we were to observe the world and say, well, that's the way that the world is, these people are treated better and seen as superior because of their race, that is, well, surely must be the way that things ought to be. With the power of hindsight, we know that's not true. We can look back and say, just because that is the way that we treated people of different races, doesn't mean to say that's how we ought to treat people of different races. So the naturalistic fallacy is essentially saying that if you look at something and say, well, that's how things naturally are, you can't then assume that that's how things should be. So you can't make like an empirical observation of the world and then from that infer or kind of conclude some sort of moral judgment about how things should or shouldn't be. You can't observe things in the universe and what they look like and how they behave and say that because that's how they have behaved, it's how they should behave going forward. You just think about yourselves. I'm sure when you were younger, you certainly behaved in ways that you wouldn't do now. But, according to the naturalistic fallacy, you should be observing yourself and saying, well, that's the way that that person acts. They run around and pick their nose and eat it. You probably did that as a kid, and therefore that's the way you ought to be. I think we'd probably object to that. And the other fallacy that is also applicable to the teleological argument that we looked at, again, I think this one was a Hume fallacy. Just trying to fit that in there. The fallacy of composition. So there's like an Indian proverb, I want to say, this really old story that comes out of kind of India about the blind men and the elephant. So 6 blind men all stand there and they feel a different part of the elephant. One feels like the end of its tail, one feels its feet, one feels its trunk, ears, etc., etc. And they're all trying to say what the elephant is. They've never seen an elephant before, interacted with an elephant. Sorry, poor choice of words. They've never interacted with an elephant before. None of them can see, so they haven't seen one, obviously. And so one of them saying like, oh, it's really bristly and tough. The other one saying, oh no, it's kind of quite long and quite thick and smooth. The other one saying, no, it's a bit sharp. And because they're feeling different parts of the elephant, they're all describing it in different ways. And that kind of fits in with the fallacy of composition. You can't really, the fallacy, the mistake, so the fallacy that's being made is that you're assuming something is true of the whole because of what is true of of a part of it, of a component of it. So a component of this elephant would be its tail. Its tail is bristly and tough. So you can't therefore assume that the entirety of the elephant is bristly and tough just because you've interacted with one component of it, one part of it. Okay, so how does that connect to natural law? Well, for Hume, for anyone who kind of like disagrees with the idea of telos and us having a purpose, etc., just because we see purpose within the universe, we might see purpose within arguments. So this is within nature, rather. So this is kind of allowing for the theory of evolution to be wrong. Okay, so fine, that's not the case. There is some purpose in the universe. Well, even if that is the case, even if we don't accept theory of evolution, even if we kind of don't, we dismiss the fact that the idea of telos is unproven, even if we accept the minimal examples of purpose that are offered within the universe, just because we see those parts, those components of the universe demonstrating purpose, that doesn't necessarily mean we can make the same claim about the entirety of the universe. Okay? So just because something is true of something within the universe, that, trees have a purpose, doesn't mean to say that we can assume everything else within the universe has a purpose too. And in the same way, just because we can say that the human liver has a purpose and the human eye has a purpose, doesn't mean to say we can assume from those component parts of a person that the person as a whole has a purpose too. Just because a part of the person has a purpose doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing has a purpose, let alone that it has the same purpose. Okay, so generally speaking, the issues with natural law and using this kind of idea of telos to say something is right or wrong is that it's based on a lot of assumptions. It doesn't prove that we don't have unique purposes. It doesn't prove that kind of there is a telos, and it doesn't prove that just because something is true of certain things and certain things might have a purpose, that it's necessarily the case for all. So one rule doesn't necessarily fit everyone and everything. There's a lot of assuming going on here.